Hi, I'm Claudia. I'm a historian, and today I'm going to tell you a story about two really incredible women. The Virgin Mary, St. Mary, hopefully many of you have heard of, and a Maya woman called Malintzen. So, I first met the Virgin Mary when I was 4 years old. I grew up in a tiny little village, attended a little school up the road, a church school, next to the little church. So every Friday we would go to assembly in the church, and we'd take our partner's hand and walk into the church, through the churchyard, and there would be greeted by the Virgin Mary. She would meet us, she'd be adorned in blue, this very typical image. We'd learn about her as the mother of Christ, we'd reenact the nativity each year. My lovely little sister got to be Mary one year. I think I was maybe half a camel one time, I'm not quite sure. So we learnt her as this very peaceful figure, this intercessory figure. I didn't quite realise when I was 4 just how important she was going to be to me as a historian, mainly because I didn't set out to research her. I didn't set out to be a historian either, but I feel that's probably a different story for another time. So my research, my PhD project was something that I thought was quite unconnected to the Virgin Mary. So I looked at the European discovery of the New World. So when Christopher Columbus set off across the Atlantic with his 3 ships in 1492, ended up in the sunny, sandy shores of the Bahamas. And then in 1519, it's the 500-year anniversary of this year, folks, by the way, when Hernando Cortes arrived in Mexico and crossed all the way through Central America, meeting the Aztec emperor for the first time. Is my mic okay? Can you hear me all right? Yeah, good. Okay. And what I was interested in, not really the European perspectives of these meetings, because that's kind of been done to death, we know about that. What I was interested in is how indigenous people reacted to the Europeans and how they identified the Europeans, responded to them. Did they see them as friends or enemies or frenemies? Or did they see them as traders or kings or cannibals, maybe? Okay. And what I was really interested in was foregrounding indigenous power, because they had a lot of it, and we often forget about it if we're looking at this triumphalist narrative of conquest. So I thought this was quite disconnected to the Virgin Mary. I didn't really think I'd come across her, but it turns out she was actually really important in these early meetings. When I'm reading Hernando Cortes's letters, there's like 5 of them that he sent back to Spain, reporting on how he was getting on, because he was doing a bit of illegal stuff, so he was trying to justify a lot of things. Anyway, he's talking about this confrontation that he had with the Aztec emperor Moctezuma on the top of the temple steps of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. And he's kind of accosting Moctezuma, saying you shouldn't be worshipping these idols, these other gods. You should be worshipping Christian God. So he places images of the Virgin Mary in the indigenous temples, and he does this all across the route where he's going. And we also know we've got some indigenous paintings of this. The Virgin Mary and Child feature on the Spaniards' war banners that they're taking as well. So I was not only surprised to find Mary in the New World, I was surprised to see her really intricately connected to these very violent actions of conquest, right? Her images are being placed in these temples, and it's all a really different side to her that I'd not kind of seen before. But whilst this was quite new to me, it apparently wasn't new to Mary. And apparently, according to a lot of medieval historians, Mary was very, very important in the Crusades. And soldiers would pray to her on the battlefields for aid and protection. We also know that in the Spanish reconquest of Spain, which finished the year Columbus went off to the New World in 1492, Spanish Christians would place images of the Virgin Mary in Islamic buildings to reclaim that space. So again, she's really tied up in these acts. There's a beautiful, beautiful painting, and the artist's name has left me, but it's this amazing painting, and the Virgin Mary is a really domineering figure, and she stood with her cloak kind of out like this, and then kind of littered in front of her are ships and explorers and important figures, and she's ushering them across the Atlantic into the New World to continue this conquest, right? So I was baffled by this. It really struck me as something quite different. I ended up talking to my mum about it, and she was like, oh, well, I was talking to so-and-so in the village, and apparently crusaders went through our little medieval church to pray to the Virgin Mary on their way to the Crusades. I was like, what? Okay, right, sure. And sure enough, if you go into our little church and you can touch the cold stone, on some of them you can see these white lines where apparently, according to village lore, the Crusaders scratched their arrows to sharpen them on their way to the Crusades. So anyway, we have this connection here, right back at home, of Mary with religious reconquest. So, whilst it was new to me, it wasn't new to Mary. And what's really important to pull out is that when we're looking at Indigenous views of Mary, we're getting both sides, right? They're seeing her as this mother figure with Christ, but then she's always, for Indigenous populations, been really tied into this kind of violent acts of conquest. And Indigenous reactions to Mary are super interesting. But what I'll focus on today is the reactions of one group in particular, called the Tlaxcalteca. Oh, sorry. And the Tlaxcalteca lived in the state of Tlaxcala, which was right in the heart of the Aztec Empire. It never came under Aztec rule. They were always independent. They hated the Aztecs. They were long-standing enemies. They used to fight wars to get captives from each other for the human sacrifice and all that kind of thing. So really, really not friends. And when Hernando Cortes came across central Mexico, with a couple of hundred warriors, they saw this as an opportunity to defeat their long-standing enemies and gave thousands and thousands of warriors, thousands. So again, going back to this Indigenous power, the conquest really wouldn't have been possible without the Indigenous allies that Cortes got across the conquest. Anyway, they recorded all of their role in the conquest in this really amazing, huge piece of cloth, which we have now lost. Bear with me. It was originally 2 meters by 5 meters down, and it had 13 rows of 5 to 7 scenes in each one, so you do the math. Lots of painted scenes depicting the conquest of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. And the point of this manuscript, it was written 3 decades after the conquest, so 1552-ish. And they did this because they wanted to show to the new colonial order what good friends they were to the Spaniards during the conquest. Look at all these things that we did to help you. Can you give us some cool stuff now, like horses, like swords, some other privileges? So there's a real kind of point to this portrayal. Knowing how important Mary was to the Spaniards, they used her as part of this strategy to show how good they were during the conquest. For one thing, she became the patron saint of Tlaxcala, but she is also found, there's this amazing, it's the 8th scene, so the first scene of the 2nd row of this manuscript, and there's the 4 Tlaxcalan lords in their twisted headbands and in other Indigenous stuff. And they're converting to Christianity. There's an image of the Virgin Mary and Christ, and they're overseeing this conversion. And this is really important because we don't actually have any evidence of this early conversion. They're kind of doing the same, we did this later. Look how good we were, we converted straight away, to show how good they were. And immediately below this scene, the scene underneath, there's one of the battle scenes showing what happened in one of the battles of Tenochtitlan. And in the wars of Tenochtitlan, we have another image of the Virgin Mary, but this time she's burning. So directly under the scene where we're saying, look how good we are, we're converting, and also look at our mutual enemies who are burning the Virgin Mary within their city walls. So this is a really strong way that they're using her to show how good they were, basically. They did a load of other kind of cool stuff as well, and I didn't really realise until this point how important Mary was. But there's the second woman who I told you we were going to talk about today, Malintzen. It's got this huge cloth, this lienzo de Tlaxcala. This is also where I came across her for the first time. And she is featured in about a quarter of these scenes. She's a Maya woman. She's got long, dark hair kind of flowing over her shoulders, cascading down. She's wearing a pink huipil or skirt. She's got European-style shoes, and she's always stood next to Cortes because she was sold to him, well, given as a gift to him on the coast to act as his translator during this encounter. So she is responsible for communicating between Cortes and all of the indigenous lords that he was meeting. So she is super, super important. And we see her in a lot of other manuscripts as well. We mainly found out about her from indigenous sources, but most of the time she's in this role as kind of more peaceful interpreter. We see her kind of pointing like this to show that she's translating. And because she's often portrayed in this very kind of peaceful mediatory role, scholars have also compared her, drawn that comparison to Mary in this sense, two very important women, both acting as intercessors during the encounter, right? But what really amazed me about the Lienzo, this big 2x5 meter story of the conquest, is that there's some really, really unique images of Malintzen. And we find in 8 or 9 of the scenes, she's in the battlefield and she's holding European shield and or a European sword, right? So what is this supposedly peaceful translator doing, right, with weapons in the middle of the battle of Tenochtitlan, right? It really flummoxed me. And whilst seeing Mary acting in these violent acts in the New World was new to me, but I found then more stuff on this side of her identity, I haven't managed to find anything else for this side of Malintzen's identity. And as far as I'm aware, no scholars have really, or historians at all, have really looked at these other scenes of Malintzen acting in this way. And this completely, like, I don't know what's happened here because they're really cool, right? They're really cool. I think so. I think they're really cool. But also, if we're comparing her to Mary because she's a peaceful intercessor, surely her connection to Mary is only strengthened by thinking about how she too is being portrayed as a warrior, right? At least by the Tlacuiloqui, the painter scribes for the Tlaxcalteca, right? So, excuse me. Malintzen, it's really difficult to interpret Malintzen because the main thing that you need to know is that we don't actually have anything from her perspective surviving. We only know her story from accounts written by other people. We don't have anything in her own voice at all. We don't even have a contemporary portrait because all the images of her are at least a decade later than the conquest, right? So we really don't have anything from her perspective. And she suffered some really difficult interpretations over the years. So around the time of the Mexican independence in 1821, she was really painted as a traitor to the nation because she helped the Spaniards and sided with the Allies, even though she was kind of given them to as a gift. And we have all this problem as to how far can we get at her choices in this. She's painted as a whore because she had Cortes's child later on. So all of this has caused, malinchista. That's like a really negative term in Spanish. This is where this comes from, la Malinche, right, Malintzen. Anyway, she's also been interpreted as she was kind of recast as like a victim in all of this, but I think that's really problematic because then it's not giving her any agency or any power, and she was so powerful, right? There's another interpretation which is, I guess, the most recent, and she's being kind of seen by historians as like the bridge between cultures, kind of the mother of the Mexican nation. So again, tying onto that language with Mary as being a mother, she too is being a mother in this sense. So, and as I say, without having any of her own voice left, or that's been kind of got to us, I think it's really important with all these like myriad interpretations that we're at least, if we're studying her historically, we need to make sure that we're looking at all the multiple different ways that she was perceived by different people and ways that she might have acted. We do not know if she stood in the siege of Tenochtitlan with a sword, with a shield, and if she was in the midst of battle. We will never know if that happened or not. But the Tlaxcala definitely perceived that it did, and there's a reason for that identification. So I just think, as a historian, we have a duty to tell the multiple stories of her identity. So, with the 500 years of the conquest coming up this year through to 2021, I think, I hope if you come across Malintzen again, you'll remember her also as a warrior, as well as kind of Cortes' translator and intercessor. And I hope next time you see the Virgin Mary, you'll remember her as a warrior as well. Thank you very much.